The silence was deafening. Lily stood frozen in the doorway of the Sterling Grand Hall, her cleaning cart forgotten behind her as she stared at the most heartbreaking sight she had ever seen. Hundreds of elegant chairs sat empty, their burgundy velvet cushions perfectly arranged in neat rows, waiting for guests who would never come. The charity gala that was supposed to start in 30 minutes had just lost its star performer, and with him, any hope of raising the money needed to save the city's music programs for children. He can't just cancel like this. Sarah Chin, the event coordinator, paced frantically across the polished marble floor, her phone pressed to her ear. Do you understand what this means? We have 300 donors expecting to hear the most talented pianist in the country, and now we have nothing to offer them but dinner and empty promises. Lily's heart sank deeper with every word. She had been working at Sterling Industries for 6 months, invisible in her gray janitor uniform, cleaning offices after everyone went home. But tonight was different. Tonight, she had volunteered to help with the setup because this wasn't just any charity event. This gala was raising money for the Sterling Foundation's music education program, the same type of program that had saved her life 20 years ago when she was a lost child growing up in poverty. The irony was almost too painful to bear. Here she was, watching the destruction of something beautiful, when she possessed exactly what they needed. Her fingers twitched involuntarily, remembering the weight of piano keys, the magic that happened when music flowed through her hands. But that was a lifetime ago, before everything fell apart, before she became invisible. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but people are starting to leave," called out James Sterling's assistant from the entrance hall. The valet mentioned that several cars have already been called. James Sterling himself appeared in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space as he surveyed the chaos. At 42, he commanded attention without trying, his dark hair slightly gray at the temples and his strong jaw set in determination. But tonight, even his usually confident demeanor seemed shaken. This charity was his mother's legacy, something he had promised to continue after her death 5 years ago. "How much time do we have before we lose everyone?" he asked, his voice calm despite the circumstances. "Maybe 15 minutes, Sarah replied, tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. "I've called every musician I know, but it's Friday night and everyone is already booked or too far away to get here in time." Lily watched from the shadows as James ran his hand through his hair, a gesture she had noticed during her late-night cleaning sessions when he worked long hours in his office. She had always admired how he treated everyone with respect, even her, nodding politely when their paths crossed in the hallways. He never looked down on her the way some of the other executives did. "What about recorded music?" James suggested desperately. "We could set up a sound system and at least have something playing during dinner." "That's not what people paid for," Sarah said, shaking her head. "They came to experience live music, to feel connected to something real. Background music won't inspire anyone to open their wallets for these kids." The mention of the children hit Lily like a physical blow. She thought about all the young faces she had seen in the promotional materials, kids who looked just like she had at 8 years old, hungry for something beautiful in their lives. Kids who needed someone to believe in them, to show them that there was more to life than the struggles they faced every day. She remembered her own first piano lesson at the community center, how her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had seen something in her that no one else had noticed. How music had given her hope when everything else seemed hopeless. How it had been her escape, her dreams, her entire world until that terrible night 3 years ago when everything changed. Her hands began to shake as the memories flooded back. The concert hall in Chicago, packed with people waiting to hear her play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. The bright lights, the expectant faces, the way her heart had raced with excitement instead of fear. Then the crushing weight of panic that descended like a dark cloud, freezing her fingers above the keys, making her unable to play a single note while 800 people watched her fall apart. The humiliation had been complete. The reviews were brutal. "Promising pianist suffers devastating stage fright," one headline had read. "Career over before it began," said another. Within weeks, her manager had dropped her, the recording contract disappeared, and the music world moved on without her as if she had never existed. That was when she had run, changing her name from Elizabeth Marie Williams to simply Lily, cutting her long hair short, hiding behind baggy clothes and menial jobs. She had convinced herself that she would never perform again, that music was no longer part of her life. But late at night, when the Sterling Industries building was empty and quiet, she would find herself drawn to the piano in the executive lounge. James had installed it for employee events, but it sat unused most of the time. Lily would sit there after finishing her cleaning rounds, her fingers finding the keys in the darkness, playing softly so no one would hear. It was the only time she felt like herself anymore, the only time the pain in her chest would ease and she could breathe freely. Now, watching Sarah's tears and seeing the disappointment on James's face, Lily felt something stirring inside her that she had thought was dead. The music inside her was fighting to get out, demanding to be heard, insisting that this was bigger than her fears. "We have to cancel," Sarah said quietly, pulling out her phone to make the announcement. "I'll tell everyone that due to circumstances beyond our control, we're unable to proceed with tonight's performance portion of the evening." "Wait," Lily heard herself say, the word escaping before she could stop it. Everyone turned to look at her, suddenly noticing the small woman in the gray uniform who had been standing silently in the corner. Lily felt her face grow hot under their stares, but she forced herself to speak. What if someone else could play?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked confused. "Lily, that's sweet of you to suggest, but we would need someone with professional training, someone who could handle performing for this kind of crowd." "I know," Lily said, taking a deep breath that felt like jumping off a cliff. "I can do it." The silence that followed was so complete that Lily could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. James Sterling was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read, while Sarah looked like she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. "Lily," Sarah said gently, "I appreciate that you want to help, but this isn't like playing Happy Birthday at a family party. These people are expecting concert-level performance." "I understand," Lily replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I used to be a professional pianist before I started working here." The words hung in the air like a confession, and Lily realized there was no taking them back now. She had just revealed the secret she had been hiding for 6 months, the truth about who she used to be before fear had stolen everything from her. James stepped forward, his eyes searching her face as if seeing her for the first time. "Are you serious? You can really play at that level?" Lily nodded, not trusting her voice anymore. Her hands were shaking so badly now that she had to clasp them behind her back to hide it. "But why didn't you ever mention this before?" Sarah asked, still looking stunned. "Because I haven't performed in public for 3 years, Lily admitted. "I stopped because I had some problems with stage fright. But tonight is different. These children need this money, and I can't stand here watching it all fall apart when I have the ability to help." James moved closer, and Lily caught the scent of his cologne, something clean and expensive that she had noticed during her quiet nights cleaning his office. "Lily, if you can do this, if you can really save tonight, I want you to know that it would mean everything to me. This foundation was my mother's dream, and these kids deserve every chance we can give them." Something in his voice, the genuine emotion and respect, gave Lily the courage she needed. She thought about the little girl she used to be, the one who had discovered magic in piano keys, who had dreamed of using music to touch people's hearts. Maybe that girl was still somewhere inside her, waiting for the right moment to come back to life. "I'll need about 10 minutes to get ready," she said, amazed at her own boldness. Sarah was already moving, her event coordinator instincts kicking in. "I'll make an announcement, let everyone know there's been a change in tonight's program but that we have a wonderful surprise performer. James, can you introduce her?" "Of course," James said, but his eyes never left Lily's face. "Are you sure about this? I don't want you to feel pressured if you're not ready." Lily looked out at the stage where the grand piano sat under the bright lights, waiting. Her chest tightened with familiar fear, but underneath it was something stronger. A voice that sounded like Mrs. Rodriguez saying, "Music isn't about being perfect, Mija. It's about sharing your heart." "I'm ready," she said, and for the first time in 3 years she actually meant it. As Sarah hurried off to gather the departing guests and James went to prepare his introduction, Lily stood alone in the grand hall, staring at the stage that would either redeem her or destroy her completely. In 15 minutes she would either reclaim her life or lose herself forever. The silence was no longer deafening. Now it was full of possibility. 6 months earlier, Lily had stood outside the Sterling Industries building with nothing but a small suitcase and $17 in her pocket. The rain had been falling steadily, turning the Chicago streets into rivers of gray water that reflected the neon signs and streetlights. She had looked up at the 40-story tower of glass and steel, knowing that this was her last chance. The job interview had been humiliating in its simplicity. No questions about her education or her dreams, just a request to see her hands to make sure they were strong enough to handle cleaning supplies, and a background check to ensure she wasn't a criminal. The supervisor, a tired-looking woman named Rita, had looked her up and down with practiced efficiency. "Night shift, Monday through Friday, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., Rita had explained. "You'll be responsible for floors 35 through 40, executive level. Empty trash, vacuum carpets, clean bathrooms, dust furniture. Pay is $15 an hour, health insurance after 90 days if you last that long. Lily had nodded and signed the papers, grateful that they didn't ask for references from her previous life. Elizabeth Marie Williams, the promising pianist who had studied at Juilliard and had been featured in Classical Music Today magazine, was effectively dead. Lily the janitor was born that day, invisible and safe from the world that had watched her fail so spectacularly. Her first night had been overwhelming. The Sterling Industries executive floors were like something from a movie, all marble and mahogany, with artwork on the walls that probably cost more than most people made in a year. She had moved through the empty offices like a ghost, learning the routine of emptiness and silence. It was on her third night that she had discovered the piano. She had been cleaning the executive lounge, a comfortable space with leather couches and a coffee bar where the company's leaders held informal meetings. In the corner, partially hidden behind a decorative screen, sat an upright piano. It wasn't a concert grand, but it was well maintained and properly tuned. Lily had frozen when she saw it, her cleaning cloth falling from her hand. The sight of those black and white keys brought back a flood of memories so intense that she'd had to sit down on one of the leather chairs until the dizziness passed. She had tried to ignore it for weeks, but the piano called to her every night. Finally, after finishing her cleaning rounds on a particularly difficult evening when everything had gone wrong and she'd felt more alone than ever, she had given in. Her fingers had touched the keys tentatively at first, playing a simple scale to test the sound. The tone was warm and rich, better than she had expected. Before she knew it, she was playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the first pieces Mrs. Rodriguez had taught her all those years ago. The music filled the empty space around her, and for those few minutes she wasn't a failed pianist hiding from her past. She was just a woman reconnecting with the language her heart spoke most fluently. From that night on, playing the piano became her secret ritual. After finishing her cleaning duties, she would sit in the darkened lounge and let her fingers remember who she used to be. She played everything from classical to jazz, from the complex pieces she had once performed in competition to simple melodies that made her think of home. She was careful to keep the sound low, aware that security guards patrolled the building throughout the night. But as weeks turned into months, she grew bolder, allowing herself to play with more expression, more feeling. The music became her therapy, the only thing that kept her sane in a life that felt like she was slowly disappearing. It was during one of these late-night sessions that she first saw James Sterling. She had been playing Debussy's Clair de Lune, lost in the gentle beauty of the melody, when she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Her hands froze above the keys as she turned to see a tall figure standing in the doorway of the lounge. James Sterling stepped into the light, and Lily's first instinct was to run. She had been caught and she would surely lose her job. But instead of anger, she saw curiosity in his expression. "Don't stop," he said quietly. "That was beautiful." Lily's face had burned with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling. I know I shouldn't be playing your piano. I was just—" "How long have you been doing this?" he asked, moving closer but keeping a respectful distance. "A few months," she admitted, unable to look at him directly. "I finish my cleaning early sometimes and I saw the piano and I used to play when I was younger." James had nodded. Thoughtfully. "I installed that piano hoping it would get used, but most of our employees don't seem interested in music. It's nice to know someone is giving it the attention it deserves." "You're not going to fire me?" Lily had asked, finally meeting his eyes. "For what? Playing piano beautifully in your own time?" James had smiled, and Lily noticed how it changed his entire face, making him seem younger and more approachable. "I work late most nights and I've been hearing you play for weeks. It's been the best part of my day." That conversation had marked the beginning of an unusual friendship. James never asked her personal questions or tried to intrude on her privacy, but sometimes he would work late in his office with the door open, listening to her play in the distance. Occasionally he would stop by the lounge on his way out, always polite and respectful, sometimes requesting a particular piece if she was in the middle of playing. "Do you know any Bill Evans?" he had asked one night, referencing the famous jazz pianist. Lily had smiled and launched into Waltz for Debbie, one of Evans' most beautiful compositions. She watched James's shoulders relax as the music filled the room, and she realized that he needed this as much as she did. Whatever stress and responsibility he carried during the day seemed to melt away when she played. They never talked about why she was working as a janitor when she could play like a professional, and James never pushed for details about her background. But Lily sensed that he understood something about hiding from the world, about carrying pain that was too complicated to explain to others. Over the months she learned things about him too. He often worked 16-hour days, carrying the weight of running a company that employed thousands of people. His mother had died 5 years earlier, and the grief still showed in his eyes sometimes when he thought no one was looking. He was kind to everyone who worked for him, from the security guards to the cleaning staff, treating them with the same respect he showed his executives. Lily found herself looking forward to their brief conversations, to the way he listened to her play with complete attention, as if her music was the most important thing in the world. She began to choose pieces she thought he would enjoy, watching his face relax when she played something particularly moving. But she never told him about her past, about the career she had lost or the fear that still woke her up in cold sweats some nights. She never explained why someone with her obvious talent was emptying trash cans and scrubbing toilets instead of performing in concert halls. That was her secret to keep, the burden she carried alone. Until tonight, when everything changed. Now, standing in the grand hall where she was about to expose herself to hundreds of people, Lily thought about those quiet months of slowly rebuilding her relationship with music. James Sterling had unknowingly given her a safe space to heal, to remember that music was still part of her even when everything else felt broken. The irony wasn't lost on her that the man who had been her silent audience for 6 months was about to watch her step back into the world she had fled. He still didn't know the whole truth about who she was or what she had lost, but in a few minutes he would see exactly what kind of pianist his night janitor really was. Her hands were still shaking as she made her way to the small backstage room to prepare. But underneath the fear was something she hadn't felt in 3 years: hope. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to let Elizabeth Marie Williams come back to life, even if it meant risking everything all over again. The children who needed this money deserved her best effort, and for the first time since that terrible night in Chicago, Lily was ready to give it to them. Lily's hands trembled as she stood outside the small backstage room, listening to the sounds of guests returning to their seats. Sarah's announcement had worked better than expected. Instead of leaving, people were curious about the mysterious replacement performer. The buzz of conversation carried a note of anticipation that made Lily's stomach churn with familiar anxiety. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please take your seats," came Sarah's voice over the sound system. "We have a very special surprise for you tonight." Through the partially open door, Lily could see James Sterling adjusting his tie as he prepared to take the stage. He looked as nervous as she felt, which was oddly comforting. At least she wasn't the only one stepping into unknown territory tonight. "You don't have to do this," a voice said behind her. Lily turned to find Rita, her supervisor, standing in the hallway with a concerned expression. The older woman had arrived for her shift and been caught up in the evening's drama. "I know," Lily replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "But I want to." Rita studied her for a long moment. "In 20 years of managing cleaning staff, I've never had someone surprise me like this. Are you sure you know what you're getting yourself into?" Lily thought about the question seriously. 3 years ago the answer would have been a confident yes. She had performed for thousands of people, had been comfortable on stage, had lived for the moment when she could share her music with an audience. But that was before the panic attacks, before the humiliation, before she had learned that talent wasn't always enough to overcome fear. "No," she admitted. "I'm not sure about anything anymore. But those kids need this money, and I'm the only person here who can try to make it happen." Rita's expression softened. "What happened to you, girl? Nobody plays piano like you've been playing and ends up cleaning offices unless something went very wrong." Lily was quiet for a moment, listening to James's voice as he took the microphone on stage. "Good evening, everyone. I know tonight hasn't gone exactly as planned, but sometimes the most beautiful surprises come from the most unexpected places. Maybe I'll tell you someday," Lily said to Rita. "But right now, I need to focus on getting through the next hour." "Well, for what it's worth, I think you're brave as hell," Rita said. "And I'll be out there cheering you on." Lily smiled, touched by the support from someone who barely knew her. "Thank you. That means more than you know." She stepped into the backstage room and closed the door, needing a moment of privacy to collect herself. The space was small and functional, with a mirror surrounded by bright lights, a few chairs, and a rack of formal clothing left from previous events. Looking at herself in the mirror, Lily barely recognized the woman staring back. Her short brown hair was still damp with nervous sweat, and her gray janitor uniform made her look exactly like what she was, a cleaning lady who had stumbled into an impossible situation. But her eyes were different than they had been 6 months ago. Working at Sterling Industries, playing piano in the quiet hours of the night, and especially her interactions with James Sterling had awakened something inside her that she thought was dead. She looked determined in a way she hadn't felt since before her world fell apart. She could hear James continuing his introduction. Tonight's performer is someone very special, someone who has been part of the Sterling Industries family for months without any of us realizing the incredible gift we had in our midst. Lily's chest tightened. He was being so generous, so kind in the way he spoke about her. She hoped desperately that she wouldn't let him down, that she wouldn't embarrass him in front of all these important people who respected him. There was a knock on the door. "Lily? It's Sarah. Are you ready?" "Almost," Lily called back, taking one last look in the mirror. She thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, who had passed away 2 years ago but whose voice Lily could still hear clearly. "The music doesn't care about your fears, Mija. The music just wants to be shared. Let it flow through you and everything else will take care of itself." Lily had been 12 when Mrs. Rodriguez first said those words, preparing her for her first recital at the community center. She had been terrified then too, convinced that she would forget everything and humiliate herself in front of the audience. But Mrs. Rodriguez had been right. The moment her fingers touched the keys, the fear had melted away and only the music remained. Maybe it would work that way tonight too. Maybe the 3 years of hiding hadn't destroyed her ability to connect with an audience through music. Maybe Elizabeth Marie Williams was still alive somewhere inside Lily the janitor, waiting for her moment to return. She stood up and smoothed her uniform, wishing she had something more appropriate to wear. But then she stopped herself. This was who she was now, a working woman who had rebuilt her life from nothing, who had found dignity in honest work even when it meant scrubbing floors and emptying trash. There was no shame in that, and she didn't need fancy clothes to make her music beautiful. "Lily?" Sarah called again, more urgently this time. "I'm coming," Lily replied, opening the door. Sarah looked relieved. "James is just finishing up the introduction. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Lily nodded, then paused. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" "Of course. What will tonight's performance mean for the children's program? I mean, if people are generous, how many kids will benefit?" Sarah's face lit up. "With the right response, we could fund music programs for over 500 children next year. Piano lessons, instruments, even small scholarships for the most talented ones to get advanced training. 500 children. 500 young people who might find the same salvation in music that Lily had found all those years ago. 500 kids who might discover that they had gifts worth sharing with the world." "That's all I needed to hear," Lily said. They walked together toward the stage entrance, where James was wrapping up his introduction. "So please join me in welcoming our surprise performer for tonight, Lily." The applause was polite but curious as Lily stepped into the bright stage lights. The audience was a sea of faces, an expensive evening where, jewelry glittering under the chandeliers. These were Chicago's elite business leaders, philanthropists, politicians, people who were used to the finest entertainment money could buy. For a moment, the familiar panic began to rise in Lily's chest. This was exactly the kind of crowd that had watched her fall apart 3 years ago. These were the people who expected perfection, who would notice every wrong note, every sign of nervousness. But then she saw James Sterling in the front row, his eyes meeting hers across the distance. He wasn't looking at her with pity or concern. He was looking at her with confidence, with trust, as if he knew something about her that she had forgotten about herself. In the VIP section, she spotted Rita, who had somehow managed to get a seat and was giving her an encouraging thumbs up. Even some of the other Sterling Industries employees she recognized were scattered throughout the audience, people who had only ever seen her with a mop and bucket but who were now watching her with interest and support. This wasn't the anonymous crowd that had witnessed her failure 3 years ago. These were people who knew her at least a little. People who had treated her with kindness and respect even when she was just the night janitor. People who were rooting for her to succeed. The grand piano sat in the center of the stage, its black surface gleaming under the lights. It was a beautiful instrument, probably worth more than Lily would make in several years of cleaning offices. But as she approached it, she felt the familiar sense of coming home that she experienced every night in the executive lounge. She sat down on the bench and adjusted the height slightly, her fingers hovering over the keys. The audience grew quiet, waiting to see what this unexpected performer would do. Lily closed her eyes for a moment and thought about the children who would benefit from tonight's donations. She thought about Mrs. Rodriguez and the community center where she had first learned to love music. She thought about James Sterling, who had given her a safe space to reconnect with her gift without even knowing he was doing it. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer Lily the janitor or Elizabeth Marie Williams the failed pianist. She was simply a woman with a story to tell, and music was her language. Her fingers found the keys, and the first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 filled the grand hall. The piece began softly, tentatively, like a question being asked. But as Lily settled into the familiar rhythm, her confidence grew and the music swelled with emotion and power. She wasn't just playing notes on a page. She was sharing her journey, the dreams, the disappointment, the years of hiding, and finally the courage to step back into the light. Every phrase carried the weight of her experience, every dynamic change reflected the ups and downs of rebuilding a life. The audience was completely silent, drawn into the story she was telling without words. This wasn't just technical proficiency, though her skill was obviously exceptional. This was music that came from the depths of human experience, raw and honest and utterly compelling. As the piece built toward its dramatic climax, Lily felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. She was completely present in the music, her fear forgotten, her self-consciousness dissolved. There was only the piano, the audience, and the connection between them that music made possible. She was no longer hiding. She was finally fully alive. The transformation was remarkable, and James Sterling found himself transfixed as he watched it happen. The nervous woman in the gray janitor uniform who had stood trembling in the doorway just minutes ago had become someone completely different the moment her fingers touched the piano keys. Lily's posture had changed first. Her shoulders, which had been hunched with anxiety, now sat straight and confident. Her head was tilted slightly, listening not just to the music she was creating but to something deeper, something that seemed to flow through her rather than from her. Her hands moved across the keys with a grace and certainty that spoke of years of training and natural talent. But it was her face that truly amazed him. The worry lines had smoothed away, replaced by an expression of pure concentration and joy. This was clearly where she belonged, where she was most herself. James realized that for 6 months, he had been seeing only a shadow of who Lily really was. The Chopin Ballade was technically challenging, full of rapid passages and complex harmonies that would challenge even accomplished pianists. But Lily played it as if it were as natural as breathing, her fingers dancing across the keys with precision and artistry that had the entire audience leaning forward in their seats. James had heard this piece performed many times before, but never like this. Lily wasn't just executing the notes correctly, she was telling a story with every phrase. The gentle opening theme spoke of longing and hope, the dramatic middle section conveyed struggle and conflict, and the powerful ending suggested triumph and resolution. As he listened, James began to understand that this wasn't just a performance for Lily. This was personal. The emotion in her playing was too real, too raw to be merely interpretive. She was sharing something deeply private with everyone in the room, using music as her language. Around him he could see the effect on the other guests. Mrs. Patterson, the usually stern board member of 3 different charities, had tears streaming down her cheeks. Tom Bradley, a hard-headed businessman who rarely showed emotion about anything, was staring at the stage with his mouth slightly open, completely absorbed in the music. Even the waitstaff had stopped what they were doing to listen. Along the edges of the room, servers stood with forgotten trays in their hands, as caught up in the performance as any of the paying guests. James thought about all the evenings he had worked late, hearing the faint sound of piano music drifting through the building. He had assumed it was recorded music or perhaps someone practicing simple pieces. He had never imagined that the woman who quietly emptied his trash and vacuumed his office was capable of artistry like this. What else didn't he know about her? What had brought someone with this level of talent to work as a night janitor? What had happened in her past that made her hide such an extraordinary gift? The piece was building toward its climactic section, and Lily's entire body was now involved in the performance. Her upper body swayed slightly with the music, her feet worked the pedals with precise timing, and her face showed the intense concentration of someone pushing herself to the absolute limit of her abilities. James found himself holding his breath as she navigated the most technically difficult passage, her hands flying across the keyboard in a blur of motion that was almost too fast to follow. But every note was clear and purposeful, every accent perfectly placed. This wasn't just technical showmanship, it was musical storytelling at its finest. The audience was completely silent, afraid that even the slightest sound might break the spell that Lily was weaving. James looked around and saw expressions of wonder and amazement on faces that were usually reserved and sophisticated. She had transported them all to another world, a place where only beauty and emotion mattered. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, James realized that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet understand. This woman, whom he had known only as a quiet, efficient employee, was revealing herself to be an artist of extraordinary depth and skill. More than that, she was someone with the courage to risk everything for something she believed in. The final section of the ballade was like watching a phoenix rise from ashes. Lily's playing became more powerful, more assured, building to a crescendo that seemed to lift everyone in the room. Her technique was flawless, but it was the emotional honesty in her interpretation that took James's breath away. When the last note faded into silence, the entire audience sat frozen for a moment, as if they needed time to return to the real world. Then, as one, they erupted into thunderous applause. People were on their feet instantly, clapping and calling out appreciation. James had never seen this particular crowd respond so enthusiastically to any performance. But Lily looked almost surprised by the response. She stood and gave a small, modest bow, her cheeks flushed with exertion and emotion. For just a moment, her eyes found James's in the crowd, and he saw vulnerability there mixed with triumph. She had done something incredibly brave and she knew it. That was absolutely magnificent. Sarah appeared at James's elbow, her voice barely audible over the continuing applause. I've never seen anything like it. People are already reaching for their checkbooks. James nodded but couldn't take his eyes off Lily. She was sitting back down at the piano, preparing for her next piece, and he found himself wondering what other surprises the evening held. If her opening performance was any indication, they were all in for something extraordinary. But beyond his amazement at her talent, James felt something deeper stirring. For 6 months, he had enjoyed their brief conversations and looked forward to hearing her play in the quiet building at night. He had thought of her as a pleasant, mysterious employee who brought a touch of beauty to his often stressful days. Now he was seeing her as she truly was, not just talented, but courageous, generous, and more complex than he had ever imagined. The woman on that stage was someone worth knowing, worth understanding, worth caring about in ways that went far beyond their professional relationship. As Lily began her second piece, a hauntingly beautiful arrangement of "The Way You Look Tonight," James settled back in his seat and prepared to be amazed all over again. But more than that, he prepared to see the woman he had thought he knew reveal even more layers of who she really was. The evening was far from over, and James had the distinct feeling that by the time it ended, nothing would ever be the same again. Lily's choice of "The Way You Look Tonight" surprised everyone, including herself. It wasn't what anyone expected after the classical grandeur of Chopin, but as her fingers found the familiar jazz harmonies, she knew it was exactly right. This was the piece that had first made her fall in love with music, long before she learned about competitions and concert halls and the pressure to be perfect. Mrs. Rodriguez had taught it to her when she was 14, explaining how jazz piano was different from classical, more personal, more conversational, more about finding your own voice within the structure of the song. Jazz is about telling your story, Mija, she had said. The melody is just the beginning. What matters is what you add to it. Now, sitting at the grand piano with 300 people hanging on every note, Lily began to tell her story through the music. She started with the familiar melody, simple and sweet, letting the audience recognize the song they all knew. But gradually she began to add her own touches, a slight change in rhythm here, an unexpected harmony there, small variations that made the song uniquely hers. The jazz arrangement allowed her to showcase a different side of her musicianship. Where the Chopin had been about power and technical precision, this piece was about subtlety and soul. Her left hand walked through bass lines that provided a steady foundation while her right hand danced around the melody, sometimes staying close to the original, sometimes wandering into improvisational territory that surprised even her. James found himself completely mesmerized. This was yet another facet of Lily's talent, and it revealed something about her personality that their brief hallway conversations had never shown. There was playfulness in her interpretation, a sense of humor in the way she would tease a phrase before resolving it, a warmth that made the familiar song feel like an intimate conversation. The audience was responding differently to this piece than they had to the Chopin. Where the classical piece had demanded their awed attention, the jazz arrangement invited them to relax and enjoy themselves. James could see people swaying slightly in their seats, smiling at particularly clever harmonic choices, nodding in appreciation when Lily took the melody in an unexpected direction. But for all its accessibility, the performance was no less sophisticated than what had come before. Lily's jazz technique was as polished as her classical training, her improvisational skills as impressive as her ability to interpret composed music. James realized he was watching someone who was equally at home in multiple musical worlds, someone whose education and experience went far deeper than he had ever suspected. As she moved into a more adventurous middle section, taking greater liberties with the original melody, Lily's playing became more personal, more revealing. The music spoke of late nights and lost dreams, of loneliness and hope, of the strange beauty that could be found in starting over. James felt like he was being allowed to glimpse into her private thoughts, to understand something about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The technical demands of jazz piano were different from classical music but no less challenging. Lily's left hand maintained complex bass lines while her right hand explored increasingly sophisticated variations on the theme. Her sense of rhythm was impeccable, her harmonic choices sophisticated and surprising. This wasn't someone who had picked up jazz as a hobby. This was someone who had studied it seriously and understood it deeply. Around the room, James could see the effect of her performance on the other guests. Mrs. Patterson was still emotional, but now she was smiling through her tears. Tom Bradley was nodding along with the rhythm, his usual stern expression replaced by one of genuine enjoyment. Even the younger guests who James had worried might not appreciate classical music, were clearly engaged and impressed. But it was the employees from Sterling Industries scattered throughout the audience who showed the most dramatic response. Rita was beaming with pride as if she were watching her own daughter perform. The security guards who worked the night shift were grinning at each other, clearly amazed to discover that the quiet woman who said hello to them every evening was capable of this level of artistry. As Lily began to bring the piece toward its conclusion, she returned to the original melody but with all the sophisticated harmonies and rhythmic variations she had developed throughout the performance. It was like hearing the song for the first time, familiar but transformed, simple but profound. The final chord hung in the air for a long moment before dissolving into silence. Then the applause began again, this time warmer and more sustained than before. People weren't just impressed by Lily's technical skill anymore. They were charmed by her musicality, moved by the personal story she had told through the music. Ladies and gentlemen, James heard Sarah's voice over the sound system. I think we can all agree that we're witnessing something very special tonight. But before we continue, I want to remind everyone why we're here. The Sterling Foundation's music education program needs your support to bring the gift of music to children throughout our community. What you're hearing tonight is exactly the kind of talent and passion we hope to nurture in the next generation. As Sarah spoke, James watched Lily's face. She had stood to acknowledge the applause, but now she was looking out at the audience with an expression of deep purpose. This wasn't about her anymore, if it ever had been. This was about the children who would benefit from the money raised tonight, the young people who might find the same salvation in music that she clearly had. When Sarah finished her appeal, Lily sat back down at the piano without hesitation. There was no nervousness now, no uncertainty. She had found her rhythm, her confidence, her connection with the audience. Whatever demons she had been fighting when she first stepped onto the stage had been defeated by the simple act of sharing her gift. As she began her third piece, a breathtaking rendition of Rachmaninoff's Rhapsody on a theme of Paganini, James realized that he was witnessing more than just a remarkable performance. He was watching someone reclaim her life step by step, note by note. And he was falling in love with her courage as much as her talent. The Rachmaninoff was a bold choice, technically demanding and emotionally complex. But Lily approached it with the same fearless artistry she had brought to the previous pieces. Her hands moved across the keyboard with incredible speed and precision, but every note served the larger musical narrative she was creating. As the familiar theme developed through its various incarnations, James found himself thinking about transformation, how something simple could become something extraordinary through skill and imagination, how a person could reinvent themselves without losing the essence of who they truly were. Looking at Lily now, confident and radiant in the spotlight she had once fled, James understood that he was seeing her as she was meant to be seen. The woman who cleaned his office at night was real, but she was only part of the story. The artist on the stage was equally real, equally important, equally worthy of respect and admiration. As the piece built toward its dramatic climax, James made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. Whatever happened after tonight, whatever Lily's story turned out to be, he wanted to be part of her future. He wanted to support her music, to help her find her way back to the world where she belonged, to be whatever she needed him to be. The music was speaking louder than words ever could, and James was finally hearing what it had been trying to tell him for months. This was about much more than a charity benefit or a surprise performance. This was about recognizing something precious when it appeared in your life, even if it came in a form you never expected. The final notes of the Rachmaninoff thundered through the hall, and James knew that his quiet, orderly life was about to become much more complicated and much more interesting. During the brief intermission that followed Lily's third piece, James found himself unable to stay in his seat. The performance had stirred something in him that he couldn't quite name, a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and something deeper that he wasn't ready to examine too closely. He needed to understand who this woman really was and how someone with such extraordinary talent had ended up working in his building after hours. "Sarah," he called, catching the event coordinator as she hurried past with a clipboard full of donation pledges. "James, this is incredible. We've already raised more money than we projected for the entire evening, and she's only halfway through her performance. People are writing checks like I've never seen before." "That's wonderful," James said, genuinely pleased. "But I need to ask you something. Do you know anything about Lily's background? Anything about why she's working as a janitor instead of performing professionally?" Sarah paused, looking thoughtful. Rita mentioned that she asked for references when Lily was hired, but Lily said she didn't have any recent ones. She paid for her own background check and had all the right documentation, but there was something about her that didn't quite add up. Rita said she seemed overqualified for the position, but she needed the work and she was willing to do the job well. "Has she ever mentioned studying music? Or performing before?" "Not until tonight. But James, you should have seen her face when she volunteered to play. It wasn't just someone offering to help out. It was someone who knew exactly what she was capable of. That level of skill doesn't come from nowhere." James nodded, his suspicions confirmed. "I'm going to do some research. Something tells me there's more to Lily's story than any of us realized." He made his way to his office on the 40th floor, his mind racing as the elevator climbed. The building was mostly empty except for the charity event, and his office felt strange and quiet after the energy and excitement downstairs. James sat at his computer and began searching. Lily Pianist Chicago didn't yield anything useful, but he realized he didn't even know her last name. He pulled up the employee records and found her file. Lily Johnson, hired 6 months ago, previous address in New York, no employment history listed for the past 3 years. He tried searching for female pianist New York, with various combinations of dates, but the results were too broad to be helpful. Then he had another idea. He had heard her play classical pieces with such authority and emotional depth that she had to have formal training, probably from a prestigious institution. Juilliard piano graduates female brought up hundreds of results, but as James scrolled through them, something caught his eye. A photograph from a classical music magazine, 3 years old, showing a young woman at a piano. The hair was longer and the face was rounder, but the eyes were unmistakable. Elizabeth Marie Williams, rising star of classical piano, suffers career-ending stage fright during Chicago performance. James felt his heart sink as he read the article. It described a promising young pianist who had trained at Juilliard, won several prestigious competitions, and been on the verge of a major recording contract when she suffered a complete breakdown during a performance with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Williams, 28, was unable to complete the first movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 after what witnesses described as a severe panic attack on stage. She was taken to a nearby hospital and later released, but has not performed publicly since the incident. The article went on to describe the end of what had been a meteoric rise in the classical music world. Record deals were cancelled, performance contracts voided, and Elizabeth Marie Williams disappeared from the music scene entirely. James sat back in his chair, pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. Lily Johnson was Elizabeth Marie Williams, and she had been hiding from her past for 3 years. The quiet, efficient janitor who had brightened his late-night work sessions was actually one of the most talented pianists of her generation, someone who had lost everything and was slowly, carefully rebuilding her life. The irony was almost overwhelming. 4 months, he had been listening to someone who had been destined for greatness, someone who should have been performing in the world's greatest concert halls, not cleaning offices in downtown Chicago. But more than that, he had been witnessing her healing process, watching her reconnect with her gift through their brief interactions and her late-night practice sessions. James thought about all the evenings he had stayed late at the office, partly because of work but increasingly because he enjoyed the sound of piano music drifting through the building. He had never realized that he was listening to someone fighting their way back from devastating professional failure, using music as therapy rather than career. The courage it must have taken for her to step onto that stage tonight was staggering. After what she had been through, after the humiliation and the fear and the years of hiding, she had volunteered to perform in front of hundreds of people simply because children needed her help. James found himself feeling protective of her in a way that surprised him. He wanted to shield her from any further pain, to make sure that tonight's performance was a triumph rather than another traumatic experience. But more than that, he wanted to help her find her way back to the life she was meant to live, the career she deserved to have. The sound of applause from downstairs told him that intermission was over and Lily was about to begin the second half of her performance. James closed his laptop and headed back to the grand hall, his mind churning with questions and possibilities. As he took his seat, James watched Lily settle herself at the piano for what would be her fourth piece of the evening. She looked different now than she had at the beginning of the performance, more confident, more at ease, more like the artist she had been born to be. But James also noticed the small signs of exhaustion that were beginning to show. Her shoulders were slightly tense, and she took a longer moment than before to center herself at the keyboard. She was pushing herself hard, giving everything she had to this performance, and James worried about what it was costing her. As she began to play a haunting interpretation of Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor, James made a decision. Whatever happened after tonight, whatever Lily's plans were for her future, he was going to make sure she had every opportunity to succeed. He had resources, connections, influence in the business community. If she wanted to return to performing, he would help her make it happen. If she preferred to stay hidden, he would respect that choice but make sure she had other options. Most importantly, he was going to tell her that her secret was safe with him. Elizabeth Marie Williams could remain buried if that's what Lily Johnson needed, but either way she would know that someone understood who she really was and valued her for it. The music filled the hall with its melancholy beauty, and James realized that he was listening to more than just a performance. He was hearing the sound of someone finding their way home after being lost for a very long time. And he wanted to be there to welcome her when she arrived. As Lily began the Chopin Nocturne, the familiar melody triggered a flood of memories she had spent 3 years trying to suppress. This was the piece she had been practicing the day before her disastrous performance in Chicago, the last piece she had played as Elizabeth Marie Williams before her world fell apart. Her fingers found the notes automatically, muscle memory taking over as her mind drifted back to that terrible night. She had been so confident then, so sure of herself and her abilities. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra engagement was supposed to be her breakthrough moment, the performance that would establish her as a major artist. Instead, it became the night that destroyed everything she had worked for. Even now, she could remember the feeling of walking onto that stage, the bright lights and the expectant faces of 800 classical music lovers. She had felt excited rather than nervous, eager to share Rachmaninoff's beautiful concerto with an audience that would appreciate its complexity and emotional depth. But something had gone wrong the moment she sat down at the piano. Instead of the usual sense of coming home that she felt when her fingers touched the keys, there had been only panic. Her heart had started racing, her hands had begun to shake, and suddenly she couldn't remember how the piece began. The orchestra had given her the opening, the conductor looking at her expectantly, but she had sat frozen at the keyboard, unable to play a single note. The silence had stretched on forever while hundreds of people watched her fall apart in real time. Now, playing the same composer in front of another audience, Lily felt the familiar tightness in her chest that signaled the beginning of a panic attack. But instead of fighting it or running from it, she let the feeling wash over her and transformed it into music. The Nocturne was perfect for what she was experiencing, a piece that spoke of longing and sadness, of beauty found in darkness, of hope that persisted even in the most difficult moments. As she played, she was no longer hiding from her past but confronting it directly, using music to process the pain instead of running from it. In the audience, James could see the change in her demeanor. Where she had been confident and joyful during her earlier pieces, now she looked vulnerable and introspective. But her playing had gained a new depth, a rawness that made the familiar piece sound completely fresh. He wished he could reach out to her, let her know that she wasn't alone on that stage, that there were people in the audience who cared about her as a person rather than just as a performer. But all he could do was listen and hope that the music was giving her what she needed to heal. Lily's interpretation of the Nocturne was unlike anything James had ever heard. She played with a freedom and emotional honesty that classical musicians rarely allowed themselves, bringing jazz-like expressiveness to Chopin's structured beauty. It was as if she was having a conversation with the composer across the centuries, sharing her own story of loss and recovery through his notes. The piece built to its climactic section, and Lily's playing became more intense, more personal. She was no longer performing for the audience, she was performing for herself, working through 3 years of suppressed grief and fear. The music became her therapy session, her confession, her declaration of independence from the panic that had controlled her life. As she played, Lily thought about all the nights she had spent at the Sterling Industries piano, slowly rebuilding her relationship with music. She thought about James Sterling listening from his office, unknowingly providing the safe space she needed to heal. She thought about Mrs. Rodriguez and all the other teachers who had believed in her talent when she couldn't believe in herself. Most importantly, she thought about the children who would benefit from tonight's fundraising. They deserved to have music in their lives, to experience the joy and comfort and sense of purpose that came from artistic expression. They shouldn't have to suffer because she had been too afraid to share her gift. The realization gave her strength. Her playing became more assured, more powerful. She was no longer the frightened woman who had fled the stage in Chicago. She was someone who had been through the darkness and found her way back to the light. The nocturne concluded with a series of gentle descending phrases that seemed to float in the air before finally coming to rest. The silence that followed was profound, charged with emotion and understanding. The audience had just witnessed something deeply personal, and they seemed to sense the privilege of being allowed into such an intimate moment. When the applause began, it was different from what had come before. It was respectful, almost reverent, as if people understood that they had just heard more than a performance. They had heard a human being working through profound personal challenges in real time, using music as both weapon and shield against her demons. Lily stood and acknowledged the applause, but James could see that she was emotionally drained. The confrontation with her past had taken its toll, and she looked as if she might collapse from the effort of staying strong. But she wasn't finished yet. There was one more piece she needed to play, one final statement she needed to make. As she sat back down at the piano, James realized that everything up to this point had been preparation for whatever was coming next. Lily's hands hovered over the keys for a moment, and then she began to play the opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the same piece that had been her downfall 3 years ago. The choice was audacious, almost reckless. This was the piece that had broken her, that had ended her career and sent her into hiding. But now she was playing it alone, without orchestra, stripping it down to its essential beauty and making it entirely her own. James felt his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't just a performance anymore. This was an act of profound courage, a direct confrontation with the source of her trauma. Lily was taking back the piece that had been taken from her, reclaiming it as her own. Her playing was magnificent, full of the passion and technical brilliance that had made her a rising star years ago. But it was also different, more mature, more emotionally complex, informed by the pain and growth she had experienced since that terrible night in Chicago. As she played, Lily felt the last of her fear melting away. This piece no longer belonged to her failure. It belonged to her journey, her recovery, her triumph over the forces that had tried to destroy her love of music. The audience was spellbound, sensing that they were witnessing something historic, not just a remarkable performance, but a remarkable human being reclaiming her life one note at a time. When the final chord faded away, the silence seemed to last forever. Then, as one, the entire audience rose to their feet in the most sustained and enthusiastic ovation James had ever witnessed. Lily stood at the piano, tears streaming down her face, finally free from the prison of fear that had held her captive for 3 years. She had done more than just perform tonight. She had transformed herself back into the artist she was meant to be. And James Sterling, watching from the front row with his own eyes full of tears, knew that he had just fallen completely and irrevocably in love. The ovation seemed to go on forever. 300 people on their feet, applauding with an intensity that made the crystal chandeliers tremble above their heads. But it wasn't just polite appreciation or even genuine admiration. This was something deeper, more primal. The audience had witnessed a human soul laying itself bare through music, and they were responding to that vulnerability with every ounce of emotion they possessed. Lily stood beside the piano, overwhelmed by the response. The tears on her cheeks caught the stage lights, and her hands trembled as she tried to process what had just happened. For 3 years, she had convinced herself that she would never perform again, that her career was over, that the panic and fear had permanently severed her connection to the musical world. Now, facing this incredible outpouring of appreciation, she realized how wrong she had been. The music had never left her. It had been waiting, patient and persistent, for the right moment to emerge. And tonight, driven by her desire to help children who needed what music could offer, she had found the courage to let it out. "Bravo! Bravo!" Someone called from the back of the hall, and the cry was taken up by others throughout the audience. James Sterling was applauding so enthusiastically that his hands were starting to hurt, but he couldn't stop. He was watching someone he cared about achieve something miraculous, and the joy he felt was almost overwhelming. Rita, the cleaning supervisor, was crying openly in her seat, not caring that her makeup was running or that the wealthy patrons around her might think her emotional display was inappropriate. This was her employee, the quiet woman who had scrubbed toilets and emptied trash for 6 months without complaint, revealing herself to be an artist of extraordinary caliber. Sarah Chin was frantically taking notes on her clipboard, trying to capture the names of donors who were approaching her with pledge cards and checkbooks. The fundraising goal for the evening had already been exceeded by 300%, and people were still offering to contribute. One board member had pledged to match all donations dollar for dollar, inspired by what he had witnessed. But for all the excitement and celebration happening around her, Lily felt strangely disconnected from it. The performance had taken everything she had to give, and now she was emotionally empty, running on adrenaline and the momentum of the moment. She needed to get off the stage to find a quiet place where she could process what had just occurred. She gave one final bow to the audience and turned to leave, but James Sterling was already there, having made his way onto the stage during the continuing ovation. "Lily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't have words for what that was." She looked at him, this man who had unknowingly provided her with the safe space she needed to heal, and felt a rush of gratitude so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything. For the piano, for listening, for giving me a place where I could remember who I used to be." James wanted to tell her that he knew who she really was, that he had discovered her identity during intermission, but this wasn't the time or place for that conversation. Instead, he offered her his arm, providing support as they made their way off the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah's voice came over the sound system, "I think we can all agree that we've witnessed something truly special tonight. Thanks to Lily's incredible performance, we've not only met our fundraising goal, we've exceeded it by 400%. This means that over 2,000 children will have access to music education programs next year." The applause erupted again, even louder than before. The audience was celebrating not just the performance they had witnessed, but the knowledge that their emotional investment was translating into real help for children in need. Backstage, Lily sank into a chair, exhausted but strangely peaceful. The fear that had controlled her life for 3 years was gone, replaced by something she hadn't felt since before her breakdown: the simple joy of sharing music with people who appreciated it. "Are you okay?" James asked, sitting down beside her. "That was incredibly brave what you just did." Lily looked at him, wondering how much he understood about what tonight had meant for her. "I had to do it," she said simply. "Those children deserve every chance to discover what music can mean in their lives. I couldn't let my own problems stand in the way of that." "Your own problems?" James asked gently. "Lily, I hope you know that you can trust me. Whatever brought you to Sterling Industries, whatever you've been running from, you don't have to face it alone anymore." She studied his face, seeing genuine concern and care there. 4 months, their interactions had been brief and professional, but she had always sensed kindness in him, a depth that went beyond his role as a successful businessman. Now, sitting beside her in this moment of vulnerability, he felt like someone she could trust with the truth. "My name isn't really Lily Johnson," she said quietly. "Well, it is now legally. But I used to be Elizabeth Marie Williams." James's expression didn't change, which surprised her. She had expected shock, recognition, perhaps even pity. Instead, he just nodded as if she had confirmed something he already knew. "The pianist who had the breakdown in Chicago," he said. "I looked you up during intermission. I had to understand how someone with your talent ended up working in my building." Lily felt a moment of panic, the old fear returning. But James's tone was matter-of-fact, respectful, not sensational or invasive. "You're not going to... I mean, you won't tell anyone, will you?" "That's entirely up to you," James replied. "Your secret is safe with me. But Lily, after what I just witnessed tonight, I think you should know that you have choices. You don't have to keep hiding if you don't want to." "I don't know what I want," Lily admitted. "For so long I've been focused on just surviving, on getting through each day without falling apart. I never let myself think about what came next." James leaned forward slightly, his voice earnest. "What if I told you that you could have both? You could keep your privacy, your new identity, but still use your gift in ways that matter. The Sterling Foundation could use someone like you not just as a performer, but as a teacher, a program director, someone who understands what music can mean to kids who need hope." The idea was intriguing, but Lily felt overwhelmed by the possibilities. "I don't know if I'm ready for that. Tonight was the first time I've performed in public since Chicago. I don't know if I can do it again." "You don't have to decide anything right now," James said. "But I want you to know that whatever you choose, you'll have support. From me, from the foundation, from everyone who witnessed what you did tonight." There was something in his voice that made Lily look at him more carefully. This wasn't just professional interest or charitable concern. There was something personal in his tone, something that suggested his offer came from more than just business considerations. Before she could analyze it further, Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with excitement. "Lily, there are reporters here who want to interview you, and I have at least 20 people asking for your contact information." The Chicago Tribune wants to do a feature story, and someone from the classical music station is asking about future performances. The old panic began to rise in Lily's chest, but James stood up immediately, positioning himself between her and Sarah. "Not tonight," he said firmly. "Lily needs time to process everything that's happened. Any media requests can go through me for now." Sarah looked disappointed but nodded. "Of course. This is so exciting. Do you realize what you've accomplished tonight?" Lily stood up slowly, still feeling unsteady. "I realize that I played some music for people who were generous enough to support children's education. Everything else. I need time to think about everything else." As they prepared to leave the backstage area, James offered his arm again. "Let me drive you home," he said. "It's the least I can do after everything you've given tonight." Lily hesitated for a moment, then accepted his offer. She was too emotionally drained to make practical decisions, and the idea of having someone take care of the details felt like a luxury she hadn't experienced in years. As they walked toward the exit, passing groups of people who were still talking excitedly about the performance, Lily realized that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The question now was whether she had the courage to embrace that change or whether she would retreat back into the safety of invisibility. Looking at James Sterling, who was quietly protecting her from the crowd's enthusiasm while making sure she felt supported and valued, Lily thought that maybe for the first time in 3 years, she didn't have to figure everything out alone. Maybe that was enough for now. The drive to Lily's apartment was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts as the city lights blurred past the windows of James's car. The adrenaline from the evening was finally wearing off, leaving Lily feeling drained but strangely peaceful. For the first time in 3 years, she had faced her greatest fear and emerged victorious. "Turn left here," she said softly, directing him toward the modest neighborhood where she had been living since arriving in Chicago. It was a far cry from the upscale apartment she had once maintained in New York, but it was clean and safe and, most importantly, anonymous. James pulled up in front of the small brick building, noting the contrast between this simple structure and the grandeur of the Sterling Grand Hall where Lily had just triumphed. The difference spoke volumes about how far she had fallen and how much courage it had taken for her to climb back up, even partially. "Thank you," Lily said, reaching for the door handle. "For everything. For the ride, for protecting me from the reporters, for giving me a place where I could find my way back to music." "Wait," James said, and something in his tone made her pause. "There's something I need to say, something I should have said months ago." Lily turned to face him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. In the dim light from the street lamps, she could see that he looked nervous, almost as unsure of himself as she had felt before stepping onto the stage. "Those evenings when I worked late and listened to you play," he began, "they weren't just pleasant background music for me. They were the best part of my day. You were healing something in me that I didn't even realize was broken." "James, Please let me finish," he said gently. "My mother died 5 years ago, and since then I've been going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. Work, responsibility, duty, that was all I had. But your music, it reminded me that there was still beauty in the world, still reasons to feel hope." Lily felt her heart begin to race, but this time it wasn't from panic or fear. There was something in James's words that spoke to the lonely part of her that had been isolated for so long. "When I watched you perform tonight," he continued, "I wasn't just seeing an incredible artist. I was seeing someone with the courage to face their greatest fear because they believed in something bigger than themselves. I was seeing someone who could take their pain and transform it into something beautiful that touched everyone around them." Lily felt tears beginning to form in her eyes again. She had spent so long thinking of herself as damaged, as someone who had failed when it mattered most. Hearing James describe her in terms of courage and transformation was almost overwhelming. "I know this might not be the right time," James said, his voice becoming more hesitant. "I know you're processing everything that happened tonight and you probably need space to figure out what comes next. But I couldn't let you walk away without knowing how I feel." "How you feel?" Lily whispered. "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "Not just with your talent, though that's extraordinary. I'm falling in love with your kindness, your strength, your dedication to helping others even when you're struggling yourself. I'm falling in love with the woman who chose to step into the light tonight because children needed her to." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and completely unexpected. Lily had been so focused on her musical comeback that she hadn't allowed herself to think about the personal connections she might be forming. But now, looking at James's earnest face, she realized that their months of brief interactions had meant as much to him as they had to her. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "I haven't thought about about relationships or the future or anything beyond just getting through each day. You don't have to say anything right now, James replied. I just needed you to know. Whatever you decide about your career, about your life, I want you to know that you're not alone anymore. You have someone who believes in you, who wants to support whatever dreams you're ready to pursue. Lily felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the performance high she was still experiencing. For 3 years she had been completely isolated, convinced that she had to rebuild her life entirely on her own. The idea that someone understood her struggles and cared about her as a person, not just as a performer, was almost too good to believe. There's something else, James said, reaching into his jacket pocket. I've been thinking about this for weeks, even before tonight. The Sterling Foundation needs a new director for our music education programs. Someone who understands both the technical side of music education and the emotional impact it can have on children's lives. He handed her a folder, and Lily opened it to find a detailed job description and salary information that made her eyes widen in surprise. This isn't charity, James said quickly. This is a legitimate position that we need to fill with someone qualified. Your background, your experience, your obvious passion for music education. You're exactly what we're looking for. Lily stared at the papers, trying to process this latest surprise. You want me to run the entire music program? I want you to build it into something extraordinary, James replied. You could design curricula, hire teachers, work directly with kids who remind you of yourself at that age. You could use your gift in a way that makes a real difference without having to perform publicly if you're not ready for that. The opportunity was incredible, but Lily felt overwhelmed by the implications. James, this is too much. The job, what you said about your feelings, everything that happened tonight. I don't know how to process it all. Then don't try to process it all at once, he said gently. Take the job description home, think about it for a few days. As for the other thing I said, that can wait as long as you need it to. I'm not going anywhere. Lily looked at him for a long moment, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, the patience in his expression. This man was offering her not just professional opportunity but personal support, emotional connection, maybe even love. After years of isolation and fear, it felt like being offered everything she had thought was lost forever. Can I ask you something? She said. Anything. Why are you doing this? I mean, really? You could hire any number of qualified people for this position. You could probably have your pick of accomplished women to date. Why me? James smiled, and Lily noticed again how it transformed his entire face. Do you remember the first time I found you playing piano in the building? She nodded. You asked me not to stop playing. Do you know why? I assumed you liked the music. I did like the music, James said. But what really struck me was how completely present you were when you played. In a world where everyone is distracted, multitasking, always thinking about the next thing, you were completely absorbed in creating something beautiful. That level of focus, that dedication to excellence, that ability to lose yourself in something meaningful, those are rare qualities. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I've spent my entire adult life surrounded by people who want something from me. Business deals, social connections, financial opportunities. But you never asked for anything. You just shared your gift quietly, generously, asking nothing in return. That kind of character is what I want in my professional life and my personal life. Lily felt the last of her resistance melting away. This wasn't about pity or charity or even just attraction. This was about recognition, respect, genuine admiration for who she was as a person. I'll think about the job, she said finally. And James, thank you. For seeing me as more than just someone who fell apart. For the past 3 years, that's all I've been able to see when I look in the mirror. Then it's time to get a new mirror, he said with a smile. Because the woman I see is someone who survived something that would have destroyed most people, rebuilt her life from nothing, and then had the courage to risk it all again to help children she's never met. That's not someone who fell apart. That's someone who put herself back together stronger than before. As Lily walked toward her apartment building, clutching the job offer and feeling lighter than she had in years, she realized that tonight had been about much more than musical redemption. It had been about discovering that she was worthy of being seen, understood, and cared for. For the first time since her breakdown, she was genuinely excited about the future. 6 months later, Lily stood in the bright, airy music room of the Sterling Foundation's new education center, watching 12-year-old Marcus's fingers find their way across the piano keys. His technique was still rough, his timing uncertain, but his enthusiasm was unmistakable. The smile on his face as he played his first complete scale reminded her so much of herself at that age that it took her breath away. Miss Johnson, did you hear that? I got all the way through without messing up. Marcus looked up at her with the same expression of wonder and pride that she remembered feeling during her first successful lesson with Mrs. Rodriguez. I heard it, Lily said, settling onto the bench beside him. But more importantly, how did it feel? Marcus thought about the question seriously, the way children do when adults ask them something they think actually matters. It felt like the music was coming from inside me instead of just from my fingers. Exactly, Lily said, her heart swelling with the familiar joy of watching a young person discover their musical voice. That's when you know you're not just playing notes anymore. You're making music. The Sterling Foundation Music Center had opened 3 months ago, funded entirely by the money raised at the charity gala where Lily had returned to performing. The center served over 400 children from disadvantaged backgrounds, providing free instruments, lessons and performance opportunities to kids who otherwise would never have access to music education. As the program director, Lily had designed every aspect of the curriculum, from beginning piano lessons to advanced music theory to ensemble performance opportunities. But her favorite part of the job was still these one-on-one moments with individual students, helping them discover the same transformative power of music that had saved her life as a child. Miss Johnson? Marcus asked, his voice hesitant. Could you play something for me? Something that shows what I might be able to do someday. Lily smiled and gently moved his hands from the keys. Over the past 6 months, she had gradually become comfortable performing for small groups of children and their families. The terror that had once paralyzed her on stage had been replaced by joy in sharing music with people who appreciated it simply and honestly. She began to play a simplified version of Chopin's Minute Waltz, adapting it for Marcus's current skill level while still maintaining its essential charm and energy. As she played, she could see his eyes widening with possibility, his mind already imagining himself playing something so beautiful and complex. How long before I can play like that? He asked when she finished. That depends on how much you practice and how much you love it, Lily replied. But Marcus, remember that the goal isn't to play exactly like me or like anyone else. The goal is to find your own musical voice, to discover what stories you want to tell through music. As Marcus packed up his things and headed home, Lily looked around the music room with deep satisfaction. The walls were covered with photographs of students performing, certificates from recent competitions, and artwork created by children inspired by the music they were learning. This space represented everything she had ever wanted to accomplish with her gift. How was the lesson? James's voice came from the doorway, and Lily felt the familiar flutter of happiness that his presence always brought her. Marcus played his first complete scale today, she said, turning to face the man who had become both her professional partner and her personal anchor. I think we might have a future pianist on our hands. James walked into the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind, a gesture that had become natural and comfortable over the months they had been together. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on the foundation of mutual respect and shared commitment to the music program, but the feelings between them had grown deeper and more certain with each passing day. Any regrets? He asked, a question that had become a gentle ritual between them. About what? Lily replied, though she knew what he was asking. About choosing this instead of returning to concert performance. You could be playing in Carnegie Hall by now if you wanted to. Lily leaned back against his chest, looking out the window at the children playing in the center's courtyard. Over the past 6 months, she had received dozens of offers to return to professional performing. Music critics who had heard about her comeback performance wanted to interview her, record labels were interested in signing her, and concert halls were offering her featured performances. She had considered some of the opportunities seriously, especially a recording contract that would have allowed her to make an album of the pieces that meant the most to her personally. But each time she imagined herself back on the concert circuit, she thought about Marcus and the hundreds of other children who were discovering music through the Foundation's programs. No regrets, she said firmly. This is where I belong, James. This is where my music makes the biggest difference. Even though you could be making 10 times as much money and have international recognition? Lily turned in his arms to face him directly. Do you know what Marcus told me last week? He said that learning piano has made him feel special for the first time in his life. That it's given him something to be proud of, something that belongs just to him. I never felt that kind of impact when I was performing for crowds of adults who already had music in their lives. James smiled, the expression she had come to love more than any applause she had ever received. Have I mentioned lately that I'm completely in love with you? Only every day, Lily replied, standing on her toes to kiss him. But I don't mind hearing it again. Their relationship had surprised both of them with its ease and naturalness. There had been no dramatic declarations or complicated relationship negotiations. Instead, they had simply grown closer through their shared work, their conversations during long days at the foundation, their mutual appreciation for quiet evenings when Lily would play piano and James would read nearby, content just to be in the same space. "There's something I want to talk to you about," James said, his tone becoming more serious. "Should I be worried?" Lily asked, though his expression didn't suggest anything alarming. "The board of directors met yesterday and they want to expand the program. 2 more locations, serving an additional 800 children. It would mean more responsibility for you, more travel, basically building this entire model from scratch in 2 other cities." Lily felt a thrill of excitement at the possibility. The success of their program had exceeded even her most optimistic projections, and the demand for similar programs throughout the region was enormous. "What would that mean for us?" she asked. "For our relationship, I mean." "It would mean that we'd be business partners on an even bigger scale," James replied. "It would mean more challenges, more opportunities to make a difference, more time working together toward something we both believe in." "And personally?" James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, dropping to one knee right there in the music room where they had first begun to build their life together. "Personally, it would mean that I'd like you to marry me," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring. "I'd like us to build this program and this life together, as partners in every sense of the word." Lily stared at the ring, then at James's hopeful face, then back at the ring. A year ago, she had been cleaning offices and hiding from her past, convinced that her life was essentially over. Now she was being offered a future that included meaningful work, personal love, and the chance to make a difference in the lives of hundreds of children. "Yes," she said, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. "Yes?" James asked, standing up and reaching for her hand. "Yes," she repeated, louder this time, laughing as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "Yes to the program expansion, yes to the partnership, yes to marrying you, yes to all of it." As James lifted her off her feet and spun her around the music room, Lily caught sight of their reflection in the window. She saw a woman who looked confident, happy, complete. This wasn't Elizabeth Marie Williams, the promising pianist who had crashed and burned under pressure. This wasn't Lily Johnson, the janitor who had hidden from her past. This was someone new, someone who had taken the best parts of both identities and created something stronger. "I love you," she said as James set her back down. "I love you for seeing who I could become before I could see it myself." "I love you for becoming her," he replied. "For having the courage to step into the light and stay there." Through the window, they could see the children from the afternoon programs gathering in the courtyard, some of them carrying instrument cases, all of them excited about the music they were learning. These kids would never know how close the program had come to not existing, how their director had once been too afraid to play piano in front of anyone. But they would benefit from her journey every day, learning not just music but resilience, not just technique but the courage to share their gifts with the world. As Lily sat down at the piano and began to play a piece she had written for the children, a gentle melody that spoke of hope and new beginnings, she realized that her breakdown 3 years ago hadn't been the end of her story. It had been the beginning of a much better one. The music filled the room, flowing out through the windows to where the children were playing, carrying with it all the love and healing and possibility that had brought her to this moment. And for the first time in her life, Lily felt completely at peace with who she was and where she belonged. She was home. Dear readers, thank you so much for joining Lily on her incredible journey from hiding in the shadows to stepping into the light. Your support means everything to writers and storytellers who pour their hearts into creating these emotional experiences for you. I'd love to hear from you. Here are some questions to spark discussion. What moment in Lily's story resonated most deeply with you? Was it her initial fear, her breakthrough performance, or her decision to choose teaching over fame? Do you think Lily made the right choice in becoming a music educator rather than returning to concert performance? Why or why not? Have you ever had to overcome a fear that seemed insurmountable? What helped you find the courage to face it? What did you think of James's approach to supporting Lily? Did his patience and understanding feel realistic to you? If you could ask Lily one question about her journey from Elizabeth Marie Williams to her new life, what would it be? Please share your thoughts, your own stories of overcoming challenges, or simply let me know which scenes moved you the most. Your engagement helps create a community of readers who support and inspire each other.